It was just somewhere around here, just behind me. There used to be a telephone box, or we believe there used to be a telephone box just right there. A call was made, a 999 call to the police. And that call would crack the facade of two ordinary people who, behind closed doors, behind closed curtains, were monsters. They wanted him to join, to become a monster just like they were, and that he would watch, stay silent, become complicit. But he wasn't a monster. And that night when Ian Brady raised the axe and Myra Hindley stood by with cold indifference, he made a choice. He acted, he ran, he told. And because of that, the truth came out, and Brady and Hindley would never see freedom again. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley carried out a series of brutal murders in and around Manchester, England. Their victims, 5 children and teenagers, were lured into their grasp, tortured and killed. Some were buried on Saddleworth Moor, giving the case its infamous name. Brady, obsessed with sadism and Nazi ideology, recorded his crimes in a macabre collection of notes and tapes. Hindley, often seen as the manipulator or the manipulated, played an active role, gaining the trust of victims before leading them to their deaths. But the horrors came to light in October 1965, when Brady murdered 17-year-old Edward Evans in front of Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith. Terrified by what he had seen, David reported the killing to the police, leading to their arrests. David Smith was a 17-year-old man who had married Maureen Hindley, the youngest sister of Myra Hindley. This connection brought him into the orbit of Ian Brady, a calculating and sadistic killer. Leading up to the murder of Edward Evans on the 6th of October, David and Maureen had already lost one child. And emotionally, David and Maureen, they were scarred by it, they were extremely upset by it. And this allowed Brady to prey upon David. He was using these emotions to get what he wanted from him. Now, when we get to the 6th of October, talk had already been about robbing a bank. You see, David and Maureen were facing possible eviction from where they lived at Underwood Court Flats. They're no longer here, they were demolished many years ago. So financially, they were struggling. So David went to Brady with the hope he could help him. He would give him some ideas where they could get money from, how they could get money. Now, originally, the talk was simple. They were going to go and rob somewhere. They were going to try and steal some money from some bank or some electric company organisation, but they were out to rob. But during the conversation, Brady turned the topic to murder, and he asked David Smith, could he be culpable? Could he be capable of murdering somebody? Now, obviously, this shocked David Smith. He thought it was just all bravado, it was all bullish talk from Brady. But how far could he be wrong? It was on the 6th of October at mid-evening when Brady and Hindley made their way into Manchester, and it was there they would encounter Edward Evans, a 17-year-old local lad. Evans had made plans to meet some friends, but he never gave it time. His friends stayed at home, so when Evans got to his location, his friends weren't there, he was all alone. He decided to stay around and wander some of the pubs that were there. Now, Edward Evans himself, he made his way to a vending machine, and it was there where Brady spotted him. Brady went over, started chatting, and he would convince Edward to come back with him here to 16 Wardlebrook Avenue to meet his sister Myra. Now, Myra was obviously with Brady at the time, or she was in the car waiting. There was no sister. Myra was obviously Brady's accomplice. Now, all three of them made their way back here, again to 16 Wardlebrook Avenue. And when they vacated the car they were driving, Brady whispered to Hindley, go and fetch Smith. Now, Smith, we know, is David Smith. And like I said, David Smith and Maureen lived nearby at Underwood Court. Hindley went to Underwood Court, where she would knock on the door. Smith and Maureen, they were in bed. So it was Maureen herself that she answered the door. Hindley said, "I need David to walk back with me back to my home at 16 Waterbrook Avenue." So David duly put on his clothes and he began walking in this direction. When they got to 16 Waterbrook, Hindley was told by Brady to tell David to wait outside until lights began flashing. Hindley went into the house, and a few moments later, those lights began flashing. David made his way to the front door, where Brady answered. Brady answered the door, and he told David Smith to wait in the kitchen for a sign. That sign came quickly enough from the sound of high-pitched screaming. Fucking cunt, dirty bastard. In a nice, normal, overspill living room, Ian is killing a lad with an axe, repeating those same words over and over again. The lad is lying with his head and shoulders on the settee, his legs sprawled on the floor facing upwards. Ian stands over him, legs on either side of the screaming lad. The television is the only light in the room. The lad falls onto the floor, onto his stomach, still screaming. Ian keeps hitting him. Even when the lad falls beneath the table, Ian goes after him, drags him out and hits him again. He swings the axe and it grazes the top of Myra's head. There is blood everywhere. Then he stops and shouts, "Get the fucking dogs away from the blood. Get the fucking things out of it." The lad is lying on his face, feet near the door. Ian kneels down and strangles him, pulling something tight around his throat. The lad's head is destroyed already. He rattles and gurgles, a thick, wet sound, a low sound, then lower. More efforts from Ian, and lower, then nothing but silence, everlasting silence. It was after the attack on Edward Evans, and with the lifeless body of the 17-year-old lying on the floor in front of them, Brady, with the help of David, wrapped the body in a plastic sheet and instructed David to help him clean up the scene. Terrified for his own life but keeping his composure, David played along, pretending to be cooperative. And after cleaning the crime scene, which took around 3 hours to complete, and after moving the body of Edward Evans into an upstairs bedroom, David agreed to return the next day with a pram to help dispose of Edward's body. However, as soon as he left the house, he ran home to Maureen, and in a state of panic he told her everything he had just witnessed. Now, the whole idea of David telling Brady and Hindley that he would come back the next day with a pram was simply so he could get out of the house alive. And like I said, he made the short walk home, but he ran home, and he told Maureen exactly what he just encountered and the brutal slaying of Edward Evans. The couple, absolutely fearful for their lives, decided not to go back outside. They were worried that Brady may have followed David back to his home to see how David was going to react. So they waited 3 hours until just after 6 o'clock. And armed with makeshift weapons such as a screwdriver, they made their way to Hare Hill Road, where there was a public phone box. And from that public phone box, they made the call to the Hyde police station. On the 12th of July 1963, 16-year-old Pauline Reade, she disappeared whilst making her way to a disco. And she was the very first victim of the Moors murderers. Pauline, she would be lured away by Hindley with a fabricated story of trying to help Hindley look for a glove that she had lost up on Saddleworth Moor. Now, Pauline at the time didn't think too much of this because she knew Hindley. She was an acquaintance of Hindley, so she didn't think anything untoward was going to happen. But it was whilst up on Saddleworth Moors, she was violently beaten about her head and her throat was cut with such force her spinal cord was severed. Now, although it would be the first murder to take place at the hands of the Moors murderers, Pauline's body wouldn't be discovered until 20 years later in 1987, when the sadistic couple would take the authorities, the police, to Saddleworth Moor and to the location of where they buried poor Pauline. So it is here where Pauline Reade is interred, and we're in Gorton Cemetery. And as we just touched upon, it will be almost 20 years, or 24 years since her disappearance. When she disappeared in 1963, it was 1987 before her body will be discovered up on Saddleworth Moor. And the headstone, even though it's fading slightly now, it does say, in loving memory of Pauline Reade, died 12th of July 1963, aged 16 years. And then it's got family members underneath. But yeah, such a sad, sad waste of a life. The phone box in which David made that call to the police, we now believe, was round about here, just in the centre of where this grass is here. And we believe it's here based on a video we came across, which shows a former primary school just set back in the distance and a reservoir further back in the hills. And we believe the phone box was just here. And it's here from where David Smith would make that call to the police at 6 o'clock, or just after 6 o'clock that morning. After hearing this phone call being made, the police told David Smith and Maureen to wait while they sent police officers round. The police officers turned up in the police car and they transported the couple back to the police station, where David would, well, he would go through the horrific events that had occurred and that he had witnessed at 16 Walderbrook Avenue. Later that morning, the police went round to the house where Hinley was pretty much ready to go to work. She was dressed in her work clothes. They asked where Brady was, and she said he was fast asleep upstairs in the bedroom. So they demanded he came downstairs, which he did. Now, the police made their way inside, and they would say to Brady, look, there's been a report of some strange encounter, there's been a fight, and it's got serious. We want to know what's going on. They demanded to go upstairs into the bedroom. From all accounts, the bedroom door itself was locked. But eventually Brady would back down, give him the key, and they made their way in. He knew his time was up. Brady had also planned to shoot at least 2 police officers when they were coming back down those stairs. In written letters that he would write years later, he would admit that his plan would be, if they ever got caught, he would shoot Myra first, and then he would shoot himself in the head. He never got that chance to do that. The police officers, when they were upstairs in the bedroom, and after finding the body of Edward Evans and the axe that was used to kill him, they also found the pistol. Now, obviously the police officers took this, and when Brady went back upstairs, I presume to get fully dressed, he went into the bedroom then to find his pistol, which wasn't there. He knew his time was up. Brady was immediately arrested, but it took a further 5 days before the police would eventually arrest Hinley. Further investigations led to the discovery of evidence linking them to additional victims, including photographs, audio recordings, and a left luggage ticket that led police to a suitcase containing disturbing materials, including photographs of their previous victims. Number 16 itself was actually demolished or knocked down back in 1987, and this was a decision made by the Manchester Council simply to stop ghoul hunters and people coming here to look at the place where these horrific things took place. And as you can see from the camera, there's just a big space there where number 16 used to be. On the 19th of April 1966, David would become a key witness in the trial of the Moors murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hinley. And despite the best efforts of Ian Brady to paint a picture of David being an accomplice in all of the murders, not just that of Edward Evans, the jury would see right through it. The evidence itself was overwhelming. And David himself, even though later in life he will be exonerated from any involvement in any of the murders, his life will be turned upside down during the court case and for many years after. During the court case, some people would label him as the third Moors murderer. He was an accomplice in many people's eyes. And Brady kept pushing this narrative that David knew more than he was letting on. Thankfully, however, the jury saw behind this. And as for the Moors murderers, they will be sentenced life sentences. They will spend the rest of their life in prison. They will be found guilty. But David Smith himself, his life was turned upside down, and we cannot imagine the pain and suffering he would have gone through for the remainder of his life. I mean, I know later on we're going to touch upon his story and when he meets another lady, but we can only imagine the pain, the trauma and everything he went through. He would have to have nightmares, or he would have slept through nightmares of what occurred back on the 6th of October and with Edward Evans. But thankfully, unfortunately, the jury themselves, they saw right through Brady and Hindley's lies. And David himself, David Smith, he was never charged for any of the crimes. On the morning of November the 23rd, 1963, John Kilbride had been earning pocket money by packing up stalls in Ashton Market. And from there, he was hanging around with friends and eating broken biscuits from all accounts. And he was approached by Hindley, who asked him to help her load some boxes into her car. He went on and he agreed, and she offered him a lift home. And at this time, Ian Brady was driving the car. Now, it was whilst in the car, Hindley would come up with a made-up story of how she had lost a glove up on Saddleworth Moor. She asked John if he would be willing to accompany her, not just herself, but obviously Brady, to the moors to help look for the glove. Now, obviously being young and somewhat naive, John Kilbride said, yes, I'll go with you. By 8 o'clock that same evening, John's parents had become increasingly worried because he hadn't returned home. But by that time, John Kilbride had sadly been murdered at the hands of Ian Brady. He was sexually assaulted whilst up on the moors before being cruelly dumped into a makeshift grave. There is a photograph of Myra Hinley crouched over John Kilbride's makeshift grave, and she's holding her pet dog. And that photograph has become quite synonymous with the Moors murders story itself. It is just one of hundreds of photographs which many, many people will have seen many times. And it's quite a frightening and disturbing photograph because she's simply crouched down, like I said, holding her dog, looking down at this grave of where poor John Kilbride was laying. The body of John Kilbride will be discovered in October of 1965, and it's here in Hurst Cemetery where he now lays to rest. And we're going to locate his grave, and again, as we've done with the other victims, or we will be doing with the other victims throughout this video, we're going to pay our respects and place a purple flower that we have brought with us. The final resting place of that poor young boy. Kilbride in memory of John, eldest child of Sheila and Patrick, missing November 1963, buried November 1965, aged 12 years. Another young life cruelly taken by, again, and I keep saying it and I will keep saying it, but that sick, monstrous couple. It was during the trial that David's past would come back to haunt him somewhat, and it would be brought up that he had been in trouble with the police before for petty theft and some form of assaults. But he also had a connection with Pauline Reade, in that he had been courting her months, if not maybe a year or two before the death of Pauline Reade. So this would also come back. And I think it's this itself which would convince quite a few people that, like I say, David did indeed know more than he was letting on. But as I keep saying, thankfully, the jury saw right behind this. During the court case, David himself had to give a detailed and harrowing account on what happened with Edward Evans, and this would shock and terrify a lot of the jury members and people in the public courts. The press wrote about it in all its detail. So he had to relive that ordeal again. And it was also during the court case that it put enormous stress on the marriage of David with Maureen Hinley, to the point eventually the couple would split up. Now David, after the court case, he was victimised. He was plagued by a lot of abuse from the public. He couldn't visit a pub without a fight breaking out. He couldn't walk down streets without being spat at. People thought he was the third Moors murderer, or he was complicit and he knew more. Eventually, David and Maureen separated. But this has only happened when David himself, emotions got the better of him. And during one incident, he got involved in a stabbing affair in which he would be sentenced for 3 years. And this was because the people at the time were constantly badgering him, constantly swearing at him, fighting him, spitting at him, and he snapped. Now, I'm not saying it's right, but I can understand the enormous pressure he was under, and so could Maureen. Now, it was whilst in prison, Maureen left David. The 3 sons that they now had were put into child service protection. They were being looked after. Now, whilst in prison, David received some bad news, and that his father had terminal cancer. Eventually, when David was released for the stabbing affair, he assisted his father in dying by mixing some pills with some milk, and obviously David's father passed away quietly. Now, David was eventually charged with the willful murder of his own father, but he would only spend 2 days in prison before he would be released. He didn't murder his father, but he assisted, or I should say he assisted in his death, simply because his father was in a lot of pain. He didn't go to murder his father asked for his help to die, and he did this. Now, some people say yet again, so that shows another side of David Smith. I disagree. I think everything that David had gone through, witnessing what he witnessed with Edward Evans, the public scrutiny, the breakup of his marriage, obviously the vilification he was getting off the public, people who had judge and jury and obviously made him out to be complicit in the murder of all these children. I think he was just at breaking point. He had nothing to lose at this point. So when his father obviously asked him for his help to assist him to die, I think he just did it. And it was out of kindness. He didn't want to see his father in this excruciating pain. When David was released after 2 days in prison, he took sole responsibility of his 3 children that he had had with Maureen Hinley. And in the course of the coming months, in the years, he found happiness in the form of a young lady called Mary Flaherty. Together they would go on to have a child of their own called Jodie. And eventually the family would relocate to Galway over in Ireland, where he would be treated just as any normal man, any normal person, and his history was left behind. But that was until Myra Hinley started petitioning for her release, to have her life sentence quashed. And then obviously the press got wind of who David Smith was, and all the past would be dug up yet again. It was on June the 16th, 1964, when the third victim of the Moors murderers, he would be snatched after leaving his home to go and visit his grandmother. And his name was Keith Bennett, and he was just 12 years old. He is also the only victim whose body has never been discovered. All the other victims, their bodies were discovered and they were interred in several graveyard cemeteries in and around the Manchester area. But Keith Bennett, he is still out there somewhere on Saddleworth Moor. Now, here at Southern Cemetery, Winnie Johnson, Keith's mother, she is buried here. And without a certainty, Keith would be buried alongside with his mother. She was so devoted to her son and trying to find his remains on Saddleworth Moor. And many search parties took place. The police instigated a lot, volunteers instigated a lot of these search parties. But Winnie Johnson herself, she would often visit Saddleworth Moor armed with just a spade in the hope of discovering her beloved son. And when she passed away, she was still none the wiser as to where his body is. The Moors murderers never give any details as to where young Keith's body was placed. And they also took that secret to their graves with them. But we're here in Southern Cemetery and we're going to pay a visit to Winnie Johnson's grave. We're going to lay a flower for Winnie. And then, all being well, we are going to make our way to Saddleworth Moor and to where there is a memorial for young Keith. I will talk more about the story as we go along. This is the final resting place of Winnie Johnson, the beloved wife, mum, gran and great-gran in our hearts always. But it is also the grave of James David Johnson, husband of Winnie. Now, he died in 1991, aged 67, but we're here obviously for Winnie, to pay our respects to this lady who fought so hard to locate the final resting place of her son, Keith. David later in life remarried and he moved to Lincolnshire with his 3 sons. In 1994, and with his second wife Mary, they moved to Ireland where they ran a successful bed and breakfast from a restored 200-year-old thatched cottage called Fairy Bridge Cottage. In 2011 he co-authored the book Witness, now titled Evil Relations, with biographer Carol Ann Lee. Sadly, David died of cancer in 2012 at the age of 64. He was survived by his wife Mary and daughter Jodie. And after passing, his wife described the peace that David had found when they made the move to Ireland. She told the Irish Times in 2017 that he was accepted for who he was in the town. Lesley Ann Downey, she was the 4th victim of the Moors murderers, and she was by far the youngest out of the 5 victims. She was just 10 years old when she would be lured away from a fairground on December the 26th, 1964. She was then taken to number 16 Wardlebrook Avenue and the home of these sick individuals. We're going to visit Leslie's grave next, pay our final respects to that poor little girl. Now, the next part we will touch upon briefly, but it isn't for the faint-hearted, for those that don't know. But the Moors murderers, they were a sadistic couple. And the murder of Lesley Ann has gone down as perhaps being the most barbaric, along with that of Edward Evans. With Lesley, Grown men wept at the trial of the Moors murderers. Detectives were crying and sobbing over what they were listening to and watching. You see, Brady recorded everything that he would do, or that he did, to young Lesley. She was sexually assaulted in the most cruel and inhumane way you can imagine. She was made to pose for sick photographs for his pleasure. She would then be murdered at the hands of Brady. Now, we're not going to show any photographs of Lesley Ann Downey. There is one that is out there which Lesley's own mother insisted that the police would release to the public, just so the public themselves had an awareness of just how deprived or depraved Hindley and Brady were. But we're not going to show that photograph. We're also not going to show any transcripts from the audio recording. We have read it. It isn't nice, but we're not going to show any transcripts whatsoever. So like I said, if people want to know more about what transpired with Lesley at the hands of Brady, it is online. Now, as you can see, this is the grave of young Lesley Ann Downey, beloved daughter of Anne and Terry, who sadly died on December the 26th, 1964, aged just 10 years old. And as you can see, the grave itself is being respectfully maintained, and no wonder why. Awful what happened to this little girl. And I do have to say as well that when things were happening to young Lesley, she was screaming for her mother. She was begging for her mother, telling this couple that she didn't know who they were and she wouldn't tell anybody. And all she wanted was her mother. Awful, truly awful what happened to this poor girl. Now, after David's death, and also when he was living with Mary, I suppose, over in Ireland, we don't really know anything about his 3 sons that he had with Maureen Hindley. We've kind of jumped maybe a decade or two and basically followed David to Galway, where he moved to with Mary, and Ferrybridge Cottage. So we don't really know anything at all about what happened with the 3 sons he had with Maureen. So for anybody who's watching the video and they are thinking the same, why didn't we mention it? It's because simply we just haven't researched that deep into that side of his life. When he moved in with Mary, he got married with Mary. He had another child called Jodie with Mary. That was his 4th child from all accounts. Obviously, that is when his life began to improve after all the abuse, after all the vilification he got at the hands of the public. People still thought he had a role in the Moors murders. But it was when he got married to Mary, that is when his life, one would presume, kind of picked up. And from all accounts, like I said, he was accepted for who he was in Ireland. So, like I said, if anybody knows more about this story behind his 3 sons, just comment down below and please get in touch, because like I said, we didn't want to delve too deep into that side of his life, and obviously when he was living with Maureen Hindley. So the video brings us full circle, and here in Southern Cemetery, not only were Lesley Ann Downey's interment places, but also that of Winnie Johnson. But we're here now to pay our final respects to that young man, Edward Evans. The young man whose life was taken at the hands of Brady, again in such a barbaric way. He was 17 years old, as we've touched upon further back, when he lost his life at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue and the home of Brady and Hindley. Words can't describe just some of the things we've read and we've researched in regards to what happened with Edward Evans. Many people will have already watched documentaries, watched films, read books on what occurred at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue, and we're covering the story from David Smith's perspective, but in doing so we're also visiting, as you'll have seen, the final resting places of at least 4 of the victims. Like I said, Keith Bennett, his grave or his burial place on Saddleworth Moor has never been located, so he hasn't got a final resting place where people can come and visit and pay their respects directly. But we're now going to find or locate Edward Evans' grave and again pay our respects. The final resting place of that young man, Edward Evans. And as you can see, the grave itself isn't being looked after as well as the other 2, Lesley Ann Downey and Winnie Johnson's. Really, really sad. And we'll read the headstone. And it simply says, in loving memory of Edward Evans, loving son of Edith and John Edward Evans, died October the 6th, 1965, aged 17 years. And then obviously it goes on talking about his mother and father. But this is the grave. This is the grave we've really wanted to come and pay our respects to, along with the others, because we are covering the story, like I said, of David Smith, and it was poor Edward, who, he was the 5th and final victim of those Moors murderers, but it was his death, and along with David Smith's testimony, that would finally bring an end to the Moors murderers, to Brady and Hindley's horrific crime spree. And without wanting to be too dramatic, if it wasn't for the death of Edward Evans, David Smith wouldn't have gone to the police, he wouldn't have witnessed the murder, he wouldn't have gone to the police. And how many more children would have died at the hands of that sick, sadistic couple back in the 1960s? It does feel horrific just thinking of that. Thinking how many more children would have died. But yet it was poor Edward Evans who would lose his life. One could argue or say, obviously, to help bring his killers to justice and the killers of the other poor children to justice. I don't know why, but I feel more... Yeah, I do. I feel really... we've been to Lesley Ann's and that... Yeah, I feel really emotional.
I think it's what happened. Not David saying, even after all the blows to the head with the axe, he still had to kill him by using the cord.
Well, isn't it weird? Out of all the stories we've covered,
Yeah.
the only time I've got upset was Sophie Lancaster, remember?
But then again, I know he's the worst.
But this one, and I'm not putting it on for the camera, this one, we've just been to Lesley Ann Downey's, and that was horrific. But this one, I don't know what it is.
I think it's, in a way though, even though he was the last victim, he wasn't spoken about like the others. Because I think the others were all not buried, put on the moors. He wasn't actually highlighted enough. He wasn't, though, was he? When you think about it.
I know we're covering the story of David, and if it wasn't for David going to the police, making that phone call when he did about Edward, and it's just, I don't know. This feels really strange for me, bizarre, because, like I said, what happened to, and I keep referring to Lesley because of what they did to her. And she was 10 years old, and you know what I mean? She couldn't fight back. Edward didn't have a chance that evening. It was sprung upon him.
Not being funny, even if he fought back, Myra would have got involved.
And, you know, we're here. It's really, really bizarre feeling. And again, I'm not doing this for camera for effect. This is really bizarre feeling. Really bizarre. But yeah, poor Edward. Despite the persecution, the vilification, the hatred that David received at the hands of the public, he did the right thing by going to the police when he did. Obviously at the time he was frightened, he was scared, he didn't know what the future would hold for himself and Maureen, but ultimately he did the right thing. And I don't know if many people will agree with this next sentiment, but in my eyes, he wasn't a victim, he was a survivor. He was a survivor of the Moors murderers, Brady and Hinley. He had years of, like I said, persecution, spat at, punched, swore at, people whispering behind his back for many, many years. And he even came to these moors himself with other people to search for the missing body of Keith Bennett. He wanted to bring closure to Winnie Johnson and obviously the death of her son. But just think, if he never made that phone call back on the 6th of October 1965, how many more children would have died at the hands of that sadistic couple? It's unfathomable. It could have run into 10s, 20s, 50s, hundreds of young children. It really is a sad case. But we have to remember David Smith. He is the man that would ultimately bring down the Moors murderers. So Vicky, we've covered, to some respects or aspects, the story of the Moors murderers, but we've tried to deviate from talking about Myra and Ian as much as we can.
Yeah.
Because what did you just say to me off camera?
Because it's always known as the Moors murderers.
It's always about them, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not about actually David Smith, who realistically, like you just said, brought this to an end.
Yeah, I mean, people who know the story, people will probably back us up with this sentiment, and when we hear the story of the Moors murderers, it is always about Ian Brady and Myra Hinley and what they did to the kiddies. We touched upon it, what they did to those little kiddies.
Because you've got to remember
yeah, and we've got to remember just how evil these people were. Because people out there won't know the story of the Moors murderers and just how evil they were. So, yeah, I get we had to mention some grotesque things. But, like Vicky said, the Moors murderers, this story is always told from the perspective of the killers.
Yeah.
people will remember the children's names, quite rightly. But very few people really seem to want to talk about David Smith. And when I say brave, he was a brave man. He sat in that house, in that room, watching this poor innocent young boy, Edward Evans, being bludgeoned to death, right in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it.
But even he said, even on the 14th blow, he was still alive.
Yeah. I mean, Edward Evans, apparently, he was still breathing up until the last blow, and even then, Brady had to get a cord to strangle him to finish the job off. But yeah, like you say, David Smith, he sat there in fear, paralysed with fear, and he instantly knew if he tried to get out of that situation there and then, chances are he would have been next.
Yeah, he would have been.
And speaking of which, it does appear that Hinley and Brady had talked about killing David Smith and putting his body up here on these moors.
Yes.
But Hinley was dead against the idea.
Because he was married to a sister.
Because he was married to her sister. And she thought it would have brought more eyes to them, and obviously with them missing children.
Yeah.
So Hinley kind of talked Brady out of it. But the plan was to bring him up here and to do exactly the same and to leave his body somewhere in these moors.
And did Brady not put in some documentation later that he wished
he regretted
he'd done
it? Yeah. And Brady, when they were writing letters from prison to several people, in one of the letters he actually turned around and said the biggest mistake that he and Hinley did was letting David Smith live.
Yeah.
I mean, warped. That's all I can think. They were sick individuals, weren't they?
But you've got to think about David Smith. He, in a way, people might say he was strong, and he was strong, but to witness what he witnessed, making that swift decision, he had to be calm, help
dispose of the body, you mean?
Well, help with tidying up.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he read it straight away that if he didn't, he would have been the next one.
Yeah.
It was swift thinking when you think about it.
And we do have the book, and in the book itself, written by Carroll and by David Smith, his own words, he does go into great detail about what he was feeling during those 10 minutes or so where this attack took place. And he also speaks of how Brady walked around the back of him with the axe still in his hand.
Yeah.
So he thought, keep my eyes on Brady, keep my eyes on him, do not let him out of my sight, because obviously he could have swung the axe down on him. Because
if it was anybody else, or depending on the time that this happened in David Smith's mind, it could have absolutely melted down.
Yeah, because he'd witnessed it.
Yeah.
He'd witnessed it.